A little more than a year ago, we talked about the investigation into Jane Sanders that was spearheaded by a right-wing smear merchant in the state of Vermont who alleged that she committed bank fraud while she was the president of a college in Burlington, Vermont. Now, what I said back then was that this investigation was nothing more than a political witch hunt, and yes, an actual political witch hunt, not a witch hunt in the way that Donald Trump describes the Mueller investigation as a witch hunt, but this was exactly the definition of a witch hunt. And today we got confirmation that that was, in fact, the case because Jane Sanders was vindicated, as NBC5 reports. Now, before we get to that article, I do want to give you some additional context because we need to learn who the individual was that initiated this investigation. His name is Brady Tonsing, and when you learn about this person, it becomes crystal clear that, yeah, this was in fact a political witch hunt. So here's what I said about this in 2017. His name is Brady Tonsing. He is the vice chairman of the Vermont Republican Party, and also he was the chair of Trump's presidential campaign in Vermont. So that says a lot, but also Politico explains that he's constantly on alert for cases where he can slip the knife into Democratic politicians, and additionally, the rise of Bernie Sanders clearly stuck in his craw, especially given what he considered to be the lack of scrutiny Sanders enjoyed. It's probably because he's not corrupt, but they also state it was no surprise that Tonsig scrutinized Jane Sanders' rise and fall at Burlington College. Now, they go on to state, on July 7, 2014, 7 Days, a Vermont alternative weekly newspaper published a deeply reported piece by Alicia Fries about Burlington College's plummeting fortunes. 2 weeks after Fries's piece appeared, Tonsing requested loan documents from the Vermont Educational and Health Buildings Finance Agency that had issued the 6.5 million bonds for the land. Now, they're talking about the land that Jane Sanders purchased for Burlington College while she was the president. So Tonsig got all of these documents, he dug through them, and he found two people that were listed on the application for the loan. And on this application, it stated that these people pledged more money than they were in fact willing to donate. So essentially, the reason why these inaccuracies are problematic is because if you want to get a loan, you have to prove that you're going to be able to pay this loan back. And the way that Jane Sanders was trying to prove that the college would be able to pay this loan back was by telling the bank that they were expecting a certain number of donations. Now, Tonsing is alleging that she lied about how much donations the college would actually be receiving. And there was also another woman who was listed as a donor who would be giving the college $1 million, but the application didn't state that there was a stipulation to that and that the lady would only be giving this money upon the event of her death. So basically, there were a couple of inaccuracies here, and Tonsig, though, is taking those inaccuracies and he's alleging that Jane Sanders purposefully cited misleading information on this application so that way she could mislead them to get this loan, and that, of course, would in fact be an act of bank fraud. But remember that this isn't a loan that would personally enrich Jane or Bernie. It was for the college while she was the president, so she had nothing to gain personally from this other than improving her own legacy. Because, I mean, you can really debate whether or not she was an effective president while she was the president of Burlington College, but she wanted to secure her legacy, so that's what you can say was really at stake. I mean, this wasn't a loan for Jane Sanders. They weren't going to buy themselves a house or a car or a yacht with this money. It was a loan for the college, so it's dumb to commit bank fraud and, be liable for something that wouldn't benefit you personally. But nonetheless, that didn't stop Tonsing from waging this political witch hunt because obviously he's a Trump supporter, and knowing that Trump is going to be seeking re-election in 2020 and Bernie may challenge him, he's doing everything he can to discredit Bernie ahead of the 2020 election. So Politico explains, Brady Tonsing wrapped these figures and facts into the January 2016 letter to the U.S. Attorney and FDIC, requesting an investigation into what he termed apparent federal bank fraud. In March of 2016, Tonsing doubled down in another letter to federal officials. This time, he made an allegation that struck to the core of Bernie Sanders' clean government image. As a result of my initial complaint, Tonsing wrote, I was recently recently approached and informed that Senator Bernard Sanders' office improperly pressured People's United Bank to approve the loan application submitted by the senator's wife, Miss Sanders. The evidence for that charge seems to be thin at best. According to sources familiar with the matter, the alleged pressure may have simply been a casual suggestion, perhaps chatter by a Sanders staffer over lunch, instead of a written document or email, and though such a suggestion might still be improper, it would be difficult to prove a direct connection to the senator. So to me, I find this really interesting because Bernie Sanders has had a squeaky clean career for how many decades now? Since before I've been born. And all of a sudden, now that he's going to be running for president, well, he's using his power and influence, which is completely out of character for Bernie, to influence a bank to push this loan through so Jane Sanders can look better. Now, regardless of how frivolous this investigation was, it was still very serious nonetheless, and it really became a national story once Jane and Bernie hired attorneys to defend them here. Now, what's interesting is that the party who was recently crying about due process, well, the implication was that since Jane and Bernie Sanders hired an attorney to defend themselves against very serious allegations, well, that must be a sign that they're guilty. No, in actuality, hiring attorneys didn't make them automatically guilty. It just meant that they wanted to defend themselves. This is something that reasonable people do when frivolous allegations of bank fraud and corruption are lobbed against you, when that can destroy your name and your credibility. And even if Jane Sanders was the main subject of this investigation, she was never the real target. The real target was Bernie Sanders, because the individual who initiated this investigation, Brady Tonsing, tried to find a way to implicate Bernie Sanders. So he said, well, there was this improper conversation where Bernie Sanders tried to use his power as a senator to put pressure on the bank to approve this loan for the college that Jane Sanders oversees. But unfortunately for that individual who ran Donald Trump's campaign, this did not turn out the way he hoped it would. And Jane Sanders and Bernie Sanders, their name is now cleared well before the 2020 campaign season commences. And as Brad Evans of NBC News 5 reports, Senator Bernie Sanders' wife, Jane O'Mara Sanders, will not face any criminal charges related to a land deal at the former Burlington College. U.S. Attorney for Vermont, Christina Nolan, closed the investigation into any wrongdoing by Jane Sanders. A spokesman for Jane Sanders made the announcement Tuesday afternoon. Jane is grateful that the investigation has come to an end, he said. As she has said from the beginning, she has done nothing wrong, and Jane is pleased that the matter has now come to a conclusion. No criminal charges have ever been brought against Jane Sanders. Senator Bernie Sanders has said the allegations against his wife were politically motivated. And now it's essentially been proven that that is, in fact, the case. So going into 2020, in the event Bernie Sanders is able to win and become the Democratic Party's nominee, Brady Tonsing isn't able to use the argument that he was hoping to use, because we're not sure how long the Mueller investigation will go on until, but there's also other lawsuits against Donald Trump for fraud. There's allegations that he committed tax fraud. So look, Trump's team, and in the event Brady Tonsing is Trump's campaign manager for the state of Vermont again, they can't say, well, Bernie Sanders also is under investigation, because that's no longer the case. They no longer have this line of attack, and Bernie Sanders' record of being squeaky clean is fully restored. There's no questions whatsoever. So to all the Republicans who were speaking out against Bernie Sanders and Jane Sanders and didn't want to actually dive into the details and be nuanced here, what do you have to say for yourselves? Because as I stated before, this was nothing more than a political witch hunt. And it turns out that's exactly what U.S. Attorney for Vermont, Christina Nolan, says as well. So what do you have to say for yourselves? It looks like you're going to actually have to challenge Bernie Sanders based on the substance of his policy positions. Well, sad day for you, because the American people are on the side of Bernie Sanders, and going into 2020, he's still the most popular politician in America. So, good luck, because you're going to need it.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.